Good afternoon. Hello there. My name's Tracy Onslow and I'm the Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for West Mercia. This podcast is one of a series explaining violence against women and girls, which you may hear referred to as VAWG. And it's part of the We Want to Talk, Hear Us. So I'm going to introduce the two people that are with me. And Jem, over to you.
Hello, I'm Jem and I'm a founding member of the Women's Equality Party, and I've been involved with the Worcester branch since its inception. I've been helping out and supporting the branch locally as a data manager and also as co-leader.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I know we're going to talk a bit more about the Equality Party later on. And also with us is Nick.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicola Lowry. I'm the Assistant Police Crime Commissioner for West Mercia. Really passionate about representing the voice of survivors, particularly within an area such as VAWG. I think it's a really important topic, as I'm sure we'll explore today.
What effect has it had on you, particularly, recently with some of the incidents? I mean, it's not a recent problem though, is it? It's a very historic problem. So, but certainly the highlight that's been on it recently. How has that affected you in your social and your home life? And
I think it's just made me much more aware of my actions, which is something I feel sort of conflicted about, to be honest, because I do it from a safety point of view, to consider my actions, possibly even my behaviour, to not, shall we say, encourage anything to be done against me, or any, to be a target, if you wish to refer to it as that. So I'd probably have changed some of my behaviour in terms of routes I might take, making sure it's a sort of safe environment. But then equally, I think about, thinking about some of the language I'm using when I'm out there communicating about this subject. I think one of the things I've talked through with a lot of survivors, and particularly in some of the meetings that we attend, is a narrative that I've equally been guilty of using, of focusing on the woman in that scenario. So, for example, of referring to a woman that has been raped, I think we need to focus that narrative away from that to a man that has raped a woman. It's the language of which we're all possibly guilty of using, and really focusing on the problem, which is a lot of male violence and abuse potentially against women. So that's something I've considered in my behaviour and my actions, and equally wanting to, I suppose, support victims, survivors in coming forward and talking about their experiences, looking at what is going wrong in terms of people's experience, whether that be if they haven't been listened to, if they feel, sadly, that they've got instilled some cause of blame as part of what has happened to them, because I think that's something that's come up as a big theme progressively, that I think there is some blame felt from victims if something has happened to them. And again, I think it's about what we can do within the system, within either the judiciary or any organisations, where we can actually move that narrative away from it being the victim's fault and actually move it towards the perpetrator and taking that responsibility. And equally men, speaking out against this, I think is a sort of key area that certainly I'm very interested in continuing to focus on. So that's I suppose what it means to me.
I mean, victim blaming, just how often do you hear that? And obviously I'm older than you guys, but I remember, when I was at school and people would talk about, oh, well, she's asking for it, wearing that, she's asking. But it was always she was asking for it. Yeah. Men could go out and do whatever they wanted to do, wear whatever they wanted to wear, but she was asking for it. Yeah. If she'd got a short skirt on, if she'd had a few too many drinks. It's okay for men, but not for women. She was asking for it and things. So
that even came across in Sarah Everard's case, where I think the judge ruled it was wholly blameless victim. Well, what is a blameless victim? A victim is a victim. There shouldn't be any blame on the victim, and that's the bit that really, I think, has horrified a lot of people, that there is still those perceptions out there that, as you say, the woman was asking for it. No, that's where it needs to be called out. It can't always be the woman that has to change her actions, and that's the sort of a key area I think that keeps coming up as part of this.
Absolutely, you've got a right, and a right to do what you want and wear what you want. And Jem, we've obviously just hearing there from Nick what it meant to her, and what does it mean to you? I know in your work it's obviously going to be a big thing, but to you personally, what ways does it affect you?
Well, I think that Nick's hit the nail on the head, actually, that the focus is often so often on the women and their experiences of this, when actually we should be turning this around and focusing on the men and what they can do to not perpetrate these crimes. And I think from a personal perspective, the more work that I've done with the Women's Equality Party and the more work that I've done with the organisations that work in this area, the more passionate I've become about how deeply this issue runs through our society. And I think it's really important to recognise that violence against women and girls is the sort of extreme end of the inequalities in our society, because we have inequalities all through society. This is the end result. And at the moment, as it stands, we're really only not really recognising that, not really handling this situation with that in mind. And so for me, it runs through everything. It runs through all of my life. I can see all aspects of this problem in my daily life. And I have a teenage daughter, and it's been really important to me to work towards making a safer, more equal world for her to grow up in. And I can see from when she was at primary school, the gender stereotyping and the sort of, the boys will be boys and the boys are rougher than the girls, and all of this sort of, even at, in reception and preschool. So these problems are starting very young and they're going all the way through. So for me, it's been a journey of understanding, recognising the enormity really of this issue and the social aspects of it.
Yeah. And I think that whole thing about gender stereotyping and so much of that comes down to commercial elements as well, doesn't it? Of the things that are available to buy. I've got two boys, but when you walk into any clothing shop, there's this like glow of pink, isn't there? Over this, and then it'll say girls, such and such to such and such, and instantly that's allocated to a girl, isn't it? Pink, and the types of things that are on there will be all, and it's quite staggering really how we carry on. But it was interesting that you were talking about your work, because perhaps you could tell us about the Women's Equality Party, and particularly locally, references locally, but if you could give us some history around that would be, and particularly your involvement with it.
Yeah, well, the Women's Equality Party was set up by Catherine Mayer and Sandy Toksvig in 2015. In response to the run-up to the general election that year, and the fact that there were no parties that were championing the issues that around equality and inequalities in society, and they felt that there wasn't anyone they could put themselves behind. So they thought, well, why don't we start another party? And it's a challenging thing to start a new party. So we are relatively new comparatively. And over the years, it's grown and become a sort of grassroots movement, really. And we've, in Worcestershire, we started our branch quite early on. So I think it was the end of 2015 that we started the Worcestershire branch. And we've done a lot over that time, over those last, 7 years. And we have run in 4 city council elections, 3 city council elections and 2 county council elections.
Brilliant.
And we've done all of this on a shoestring because we don't have a budget. But our main aim is to change the nature of the conversation, and is to ensure that these issues, violence against women and girls is one of those issues, but the inequality in general is what we're sort of fighting against.
Obviously, police officers are paid at the same, it's a national pay structure, but it's the opportunities to get women to the top of those organisations. They may be paid the same at that level, but it's to get them to get them up
through
there.
that. And I think that's one of the issues that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of, is that when you talk about equal pay, people sort of say, well, people are getting paid the same for the same job, because if they weren't, that's already illegal. But what we're talking about is the fact that those opportunities aren't given, and there is a significant inequality, and it's across the board. Interestingly, though, not in Worcestershire County Council. Actually, that has a very good equal pay reputation. So that is really positive, and it just goes to show that we can make it work. Actually, if we put the effort in. So that's really good to see.
Definitely. And what's the public reaction been? Are they very pleased to see, as you say, the Women's Equality Party sort of acting, on almost on their behalf, really trying to instil equality in society? Has it been really positive, the reception you've had?
Yeah, actually, surprisingly so. I mean, if you listen to social media or you go onto some of the Facebook groups and things, you might think quite negatively about people's positions because it's so polarised in there. But when you actually go and knock on the doors and you talk to people, actually people are really, really reasonable and very engaged and very interested. I've done quite a lot of canvassing over the years, and it's been so nice to speak to people and hear what they think. I think we are challenged in our current situation because it's a sort of two-party race, and I think a lot of people it's a big step for people to step outside of that, which is why we've been so pleased when we have got the votes. But the main motivation for us hasn't been necessarily winning a seat, but has actually just been getting out there and making people think about the conversations and the issues. And I think one of the things that we've done is run hustings where we've engaged people, and all of the representatives that have turned up to those hustings have then had to answer questions about what are you doing about violence against women and girls? What are you doing about the gender pay gaps in your organisation? So these are questions that they haven't necessarily had to answer before, and by just simply standing in the elections, it means that we get a seat at the table, which is
absolutely and part of that conversation. And I think it's ethos with the Green Party as well, isn't it? That they may not, take over councils or become the governing, the ruling party, but there's so much. It's bringing that conversation out, isn't it? It's absolutely bringing that conversation out. And you end up with the other parties taking bits of that conversation and turning it into legislation, don't you? Which is, so either way, you end up with your objective, don't you? So, you've got to use all routes to get there, haven't you?
And that's spot on, actually. That is our main aim, is we don't want to be a party. I don't want to be spending my time, fighting this battle. So I'd be more than happy if one of the bigger parties would actually take this on and take it seriously. But I think what we're finding at the moment is that sadly that doesn't really feel to be the case, and that battle is still being fought.
It's still ensuring that your voice is heard as part of that discussion, holding people to account, as you say, in a more public environment, so people can be answering and hopefully starting to tackle some of these difficult questions, because sadly a lot of the discussions around violence against women are quite taboo subjects. For example, pornography is sadly a big conflator of one of the areas I think that men particularly commit certain offences, because they normalise that highly violent sexual behaviour. But again, it's a very taboo subject, isn't it? That people just want to stick their head in a box of sand or not actually talk about it yet, even though it's readily available, literally at the touch of a button. So it's really good that you're having these conversations publicly and raising awareness. What sort of major changes would you like to try and see to address the issues that surround VAWG?
Well, I think that during the lockdown, where we saw a huge increase in domestic violence, sadly, and it was really clear that the government certainly wasn't prepared for that and didn't really know how to handle that. And we did have one example of down in Surrey where an organisation recognised what was going to come and got on the phone to a housing association and started arranging safe houses for people, but that was happening in little pockets, but there wasn't an organised national campaign or system in place for that. And then I think that was followed by Sarah Everard's murder, and the groundswell of feeling that prompted was extremely powerful. And I think it was just that people had seen this increase in violence in people's homes, and now it was on the streets as well. And I think that there was a really strong reaction to that. So I think what we've seen actually is a shift in people's attitudes to this issue and to actually starting to take it seriously. We saw that in our Reclaim the Night march that we did in Worcester in November. It was our second one. We'd actually run one in 2019, and I think about 100 people had turned up, and it was quite small, but had meaning. But this time we had over 500 people.
Brilliant.
And people were really passionate. And after the walk, we gathered together and people shared stories of their experiences. And a lot of the people who stood up and spoke were very young, and they were so brave and so inspiring to stand there and talk about these horrendous experiences that had happened to them. So I think there has been a shift in attitude from the public, and I would really like to see that reflected in the authorities that can actually do something. So as it stands at the moment, there isn't that momentum there, and I think it would be nice to see it taken seriously and recognised at the level that it needs to be recognised. And as I was saying, that it is the extreme result of inequalities through society, and if we can manage those, then we can hopefully work towards eliminating violence against women and girls.
I mean, I think that's it's interesting that you bring up DA, because, when you talk to some policing colleagues that have been in the force for a long time, and they've seen the change in attitude towards DA, because very much at the start, it was around, and some of the colleagues I'm talking about have been in 25 years plus. And, it's a domestic, as if it's almost nothing to do with it. It's a domestic. And actually, if she doesn't want to press charges, that's it then. Sorry, there's nothing we can do. And that's not a fault of policing colleagues. That's a fault of society in itself, is saying, well, actually, every man's home is his castle, and what he wants to do in that castle's up to him. And you can see that dialogue changing, because I think people realise now that, besides the women that are affected, the children that are affected, the outcomes and likelihoods for those children that see domestic abuse, and for women, if they see their mothers going through that, if they see their sisters going through it, the effect it has on them and their, lifelong outcomes. And it was interesting where you were talking there about safe places for women to go, because I am desperate to see that dialogue move on to actually, why is she going anywhere?
Well, absolutely.
Why is she going anywhere? And, if it's got to be a temporary situation, then he needs to go somewhere. I'm assuming it's a he and a she, and I'm only saying that because obviously the bulk isn't it? But we always bear in mind that DA isn't just always a male perpetrator, is it? But, you're uprooting and people say, why doesn't she leave? And you think, why doesn't he stop? That should automatically be, why doesn't he stop?
Yeah, it's looking at the man changing their behaviour, and it's not, and it needs to come, I think, from a non-shaming point of view, but then equally, it's, I think, a big part of this is education, because as you were saying, the impacts that it can have from domestic abuse setting to right through to sexual violence, which is another area which, whilst there's a big focus on domestic abuse, and that's all very positive, the big elephant in the room sometimes is sexual violence. It's a very taboo subject. It can involve people from all spectrums of society, which make it incredibly difficult and sometimes challenging, particularly from a court point of view. And it is very much looking at the impacts that has on people and why it's happening. So no, I absolutely agree. I mean, just going back to what you were saying, Jem, about some of the activity that you've done as a party. What have you done? I know you were talking about one of the events that you've done, but is there any other areas of the party that you've supported to see that change in society that you think would be very useful to sort of explore?
Yeah, I mean, the Women's Equality Party in general, and we've mirrored this locally, is about raising awareness of the fact that this is about the general inequalities in society, and that if we can manage those, then perhaps we can manage the violence, and raising the importance of how of recognizing that actually, and also of showing that actually we can work towards an environment and a society where we don't have violence perpetuated on this scale. I mean, there tends to be this sort of attitude that it's almost inevitable. There's nothing we can really do about it. We can't fix it. And I think what we believe very strongly is that actually, yes, we can fix it. Yeah. And I think, if you look at seatbelt wearing, for example, it took 20 years of campaigning by the government to kind of really embed that in society. And the same with drink driving and smoking. And, we see these campaigns where, a lot of money, millions of pounds are put into it. And yet when it comes to violence against women and girls, that is not happening. There is not that consistent process. So we are looking at, we've been running a number of campaigns really around that. And one of the ones that we started following Sarah Everard's murder was to do an investigation into misogyny within the police force, because we often hear about scenarios where actually there's been signs all along the way and people just haven't taken them seriously. They haven't thought that that might mean that that man might go out and commit a crime. And it's about recognising that and understanding that. And whilst misogyny is rife, it means that these organisations don't take on board that they need to make these changes and that they need to maybe shift the way that they're looking at it, because they maybe just don't even see it. I mean, this is one of the things about representation, actually, at all levels in society, is if women aren't at the table, then nobody's there to say, but have you thought about this? And have you thought about that? And misogyny can exist there. It doesn't have to be
outright and blatant.
And it can just be there and with unconscious bias as well at work.
Sort of wondering what more do you think can be done by individuals, the society as a whole, but from the police and partners as well? What types of things do you think can be done? Is it that challenge for you?
I think that what we need individuals to properly engage with this as an issue, to recognise it, but also to use their voice. We see a disappointingly low turnout at elections. People just don't vote. And I don't think that people necessarily appreciate how powerful their councillors are and their PCCs are, and all of the people that they get the opportunity to have a say about who is running their society. And so I would really like to see people engaging more. I would like to see people getting involved with organisations that deal with these issues and taking an active interest and activating themselves. And because one of the biggest problems that we have around this topic is apathy at all levels. See this shift that we've seen over the last few years within the public consciousness, and I think it's really important to maintain that momentum and push it through. So I would like to see that. So for me, like putting in improved street lighting or giving girls rape alarms it's almost insulting, really, because it isn't getting to the bottom of the problem. I mean, it's laying the responsibility at the feet of the women, and saying to them, you should, protect yourself. And I think, we really need to shift that system. I think that's what I would like to see happen.
And have you seen men, because as you say, I think a lot of women are now taking more definitive action, if you want to refer to it as that, not just talking about actually getting involved, which is in some ways good to see. I know it's come out of, sadly, a lot of devastation, for example, the Sarah Everard case, but it has at least sort of called for positive action on women's behalf. Do you think men are starting to acknowledge, I suppose, the root of the problem in some of their behaviours, whilst they might not hopefully ever become perpetrators, but equally I think calling out some of the behaviour which fuels some of this dialogue?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a massive fan of of doing active bystander training and looking at unconscious bias, and just having a better understanding of how do we shift, especially the attitudes of sort of younger. And I mean, we can start, as I said, like the gender stereotyping starts in primary school. So we can start educating kids in primary school in an age appropriate way. And I think it's really important. I mean, my daughter used to do peer massage when she was in reception class, and they were always taught to, before they did it, to ask the other person if it was okay. And I think, that's consent. And we need to be teaching people, how healthy relationships look, and we need to be encouraging young men to call out their friends if they feel that they're being sexist or misogynistic, and stop it from being cool to behave like that. So I think that is really important. And I think the focus does need to be on men, and that can go all the way through the ages, I think.
Yeah, and I've started to see some of that on YouTube, where men are sort of in environments where people are taking that acknowledgement, and it isn't easy. I'm not underestimating the task, at hand potentially there, but it's good that men are starting to have these conversations publicly, privately, and you can slowly start to see that change, and hopefully that will grow. Is there one message you wanted to pass on to listeners about VAWG for people to take away from this, to really think about? that you wanted to end on today?
Yeah, I think it is just really important to recognise how this is just the symptom of a sort of broken society, of the inequalities in our society. And I think it's also really important to recognise that, you know, there are intersections where this becomes massively more problematic, where, you know, when you're talking about women of colour or women with disabilities or, you know, the LGBTQI community, this becomes even more problematic, and the support that they're getting becomes more problematic, and the lack of funding for those support agencies is a real issue. So
thank you very much, guys. Thanks very much, Jem, for joining us today, and that's it. Thank you
for having me.
Thank you.